We're on. Good evening, everybody. Thank you to Healing Sixes for bringing the show up. I know there are a few people in the chat room that really enjoyed that. So, welcome to Dave Moss Unsprung. And yes, that's me. Tonight's show is brought to you by sportbikerange.com. Go there. Lots of great deals on parts. Not only that, but we also give you the videos on how to install the parts. So that's something that nobody else does. Sportbikerange.com. After the show, go there and visit. And of course, as always with our weekly show, please get your questions into Sean early via the Ustream chat room or via Twitter so that he can compile those, and then when we go to Q&A, we can have a long stream of questions to answer as we usually do. And normally I can't get to every single one, but we'll see how we do this week. All right, our topic this week is fork oil. We're going to go a little bit longer than normal in terms of the segment before we go to Q&A because there's a lot to cover. So let's dive into this, much as we do every week. In front of me we have a nice array of blends, weights, and manufacturers of fork oil. So let's start with the front row. Our Repsol 10/20 weight, our Honda 10 weight, Yamaha's range of oils, this one is 15, Motul 5, Olin's 5, Maxima 5. Then we have Motul 10, our Torco 20, and Bel-Ray 30. So we're going to divide these into a couple of categories here. Cartridge forks and non-cartridge forks, i.e. damping rod forks. Now, every fork that comes from a manufacturer, Showa, Kayaba, Olin's, has a specified and predetermined weight of oil that they use because they've designed and developed the valving internally for that specific weight of oil. Now, if you can't get that oil and you need to service them, there are other options, obviously, as we have displayed here with different weights, where you could use that as a substitute. So in this instance, if we're talking about cartridge forks, we are going to remove our back row out of the way. Why is the reason for that? Well, you never use anything heavier than a 15 weight oil in a cartridge fork. Now that's a general statement. We find, and personally through riding experience I have found, that a 20 weight oil is quite simply too heavy. It just will not work with the valving. There's lots of problems involved with that. So if your OEM oil is a 5, a 7, or a 10, or even a 15, then you can replace with all of these. Now for the mad professors that are out there, they will start screaming and yelling all about oil viscosity index. So we will not get into the science of oil, but what I would advise you to do while you're all keen and eager this evening is to go to Google and go ahead and type in viscosity oil index table. You'll get a lot of links to some really, really good information. Why do you need that? Well, quite simple. If there's, for example, super producer Chris has an RC51 that takes Honda 10 weight oil. If he cannot get that Honda 10 weight oil, what is the closest oil that he can buy that will work performance-wise very similar to this particular oil? And if you use an oil viscosity index, that will tell you precisely what's in the heat range and the viscosity based on the performance of this oil. So if you can't get your chosen oil, you will get something that will give you damn near 99% of that in terms of performance. Now we have obviously our pint size capabilities here and our 2 pint behind. People often make the mistake of saying, oh, this is enough for 2 forks, or buy 2 of these because there's one for each fork leg. So just to point out for you, 1 pint equals 1 leg in general terms. There are some forks out there that take more than a pint per leg. So when you do this exercise of changing your fork oil, you need to know how much came out, how much you need to put back in, and that will tell you what size you need. Obviously, if you have a couple bikes and you're going to do this frequently and they take the same oil, then you're going to buy a much bigger container and then siphon out of that and move forward in that direction. So Standard forks will always come with somewhere around a 7 to 10 weight oil, which is our front row. You'll see that extremely commonly in most things out there. If we move those out of the way and leave ourselves with these 4, and let's get rid of that actually and leave ourselves with 3. With our Maxima, Öhlins, and Motul, they're all 5 weight. 5 weight, as a general rule and general principle, is the oil that is always used when forks are taken apart, revalved, and reworked to improve their performance. The engineering and the fluid dynamics behind revalving and changing a piston and putting the correct shim stack on top of that piston is, for the majority of forks that are reworked out there, all based on 5 weight viscosity oil. So if you have revalved forks, you should be using a 5 weight oil. If you don't know what you have, then obviously at some point when those forks get strip cleaned, you'll find out if it's stock or it's not, and then you'll use an appropriate oil. These oils obviously are engineered specifically for performance and durability, so they last a long time. But if you look at these 3 oils on an oil viscosity index table, they are actually quite different. So for those guys that are going to go there, use these 3, Maxima, Öhlins, and Motul, and go look at those under the 5 weight category and see how they differ based on heat range and flow. Some are thinner, some are thicker. Very interesting information, especially when we get into our next topic of area, which is weather and ambient temperature. So for example, our forks are valved and normally use 5 weight oil. Well, if it's 30 degrees out and you're riding and or racing, say it's Willow Springs in January, you may drop down to a 2.5 weight oil, just because the oil needs to flow faster to get some heat so you can get suspension action. So you may drop down to a 2.5 and then as the weather warms up, go to a 5 weight. Now the same could be true if you were engineered for a 5, but when you get to somewhere like Willow Springs or Thunder Hill Raceway Park, where it's 118 to 120 degrees, 5 weight may be too light, and you move up to 7.5 weight or 7 weight oil, which will help take care of some of the heat and also give you less fade when the oil gets really hot. So in general with cartridge forks, seasons, lighter oil when it's colder, slightly heavier oil when it's warmer, and no heavier than 15 weight oil in a cartridge fork. A great use of that we found is the 0607 Yamaha R6. If you're going to the track and it's really hot, 15 weight oil in those forks works absolutely brilliantly. So there's an example of testing giving you qualitative results where you know that's going to work. So we're done with our 5 weight. Now let's bring in our others. And we'll go, let's see, 10, 20, and 30. Let's make sure those are positioned correctly for everybody back home. All right. Now with this array of oils, you can use them in a damping rod fork. So let's say a Suzuki SV650, a Kawasaki Ninja 650, an EX250, anything that just has a fork cap on it where there's no adjustability based in the cartridge itself, it's just a damper rod fork. In those instances, depending on your body weight and the spring rate that goes into that fork, you may be able to use a 10 or a 15 or somewhere in that range of oil. However, the bigger the spring, the heavier the oil. So if we keep our 10s together and put the 15, we've got 15, 20, and 30. Now, again, from my experience when I was racing up in Oregon with an SV650 with the stock fork, an emulator, springs, and preload spacers, in general, I would run 20 weight oil in the fork. However, if it got above 80 degrees, this didn't cut it, and I would move up to 30 weight oil. The reason behind that was because of the heat, the 20 weight would seem to fade. Portland has a mile-long straight, And when you got to braking, the fork would oscillate a lot on the rebound stroke, giving me pump when I'm trying to brake at full speed, top down in 6th gear. Not much fun. Put the 30 weight in, problem evaporates, it's gone. The other application here is that based on your body weight and the spring that you need, one of these oils might work quite well with a stock damping rod where you don't have to modify it. So if you're on the lighter end of the spectrum, 15 weight or less may work just fine for you. If you're going heavier, then obviously you can go up to 30 weight, and in instances like that, that's really as heavy as you will go. If we're talking about cruisers or bikes like that, then we'll go well beyond 30 weight oil. And in some instances, I've seen somebody go double that and even triple that in weight of oil to try and stop their cruiser pogoing. Again, based on what you want. Experiment with oil changes, and the more often you do it, the quicker you'll find the oil you're looking for. So this is our this is our damping rod selection of oils based on the spring. The heavier the spring, the faster it's going to rebound. Therefore, the thicker the oil you're going to need to have in your forks to compensate for that. That covers our selection of oils, our rationale between cartridge forks, revalved 5 weight, 10 weight stock, 15 weight in some instances, and based on ambient temperatures, upping or decreasing the weight of the oil based on the season or the high temps that you're going to deal with. That will make a phenomenal difference in the way that the fork works. So, while I rearrange all of this, please remember after the show to go to sportbikewrench.com. Great parts for sale, and more importantly, videos showing you how to do the installation. Next on our list, the internals of a fork. So, what we have here, this is out of a ZX6 Kawasaki. We have our fork cap, preload spacer, and spring. Then we have our inner cartridge. And at the bottom of our cartridge, which I'm going to take out, is our compression adjuster. Now please note that this is the base. It will sit this way. So out of the bottom of the cartridge, just simply unscrews the compression piston and the compression holder. Now the reason I'm showing you this is that when the spring moves in the fork, it will wobble slightly and it will also compress. When it compresses, it will swell slightly. When it does that, it scrapes on the inside of the fork, producing a metal paste. Well, guess what's at the bottom? In the worst possible place. A piston on a holder that will just get absolutely covered in metal shavings. Now, we took a photograph for you earlier of a couple of pistons that I pulled out from the shop to show you, in part, why it's really important that not only you change the oil, but in instances of this, with the piston, that gets cleaned regularly. So, Dave may be able to zoom in for us on a piston there. If I pull it back a little bit and put it in shot, you can see how small it is. Unfortunately, my hand creates, there we go. If I can get some light behind it the other way. There we go. All right. Now you can see how big the holes, not the slots, the holes are in this piston. You can imagine how much oil can flow forwards and backwards through that piston. Now, let's change that for a stock piston. I'll wait for Dave to pull the picture up. Oh, we lost the feed. There we go. Let me try this.
I got the comparo picture too.
There. Now the slots you can see, but you cannot see, there we go. It's almost like a needle hole. It's that small.
Here's two compared, right there.
So there's a comparison of the picture we took earlier. You can't see the holes in the compression piston, they're that small. So what that means is that all that metal particulate and debris in the bottom of the fork itself, sits in that piston and gets pounded into it. And because the hole is so small, no matter what you do with your compression adjuster, in or out, you have no compression damping because the hole is blocked. Oftentimes, with a stock piston like this, we have to go in and drill it, physically drill it out and get all out of it. It was funny, at AFM races this weekend, we went into Bakersfield and did a seminar at a dealership. There was a guy there with an FJR that rode 50,000 miles on his stock forks, never blew the fork seal, but it's the same oil in there. He could not understand why the valving for compression didn't work until we gave him this example, and then it made sense. So oftentimes we've talked about changing oil regularly. Now here's another reason why with tiny little pistons like this, it is of extreme importance that you do it regularly. Not only because of the picture that you're seeing right now, the flow differential in terms of the holes it goes through, allowing the oil through, but when it's really small, it can get blocked. And that does you no favors at all. So it is worth at this point mentioning out that at least every 2 years, your piston, especially your compression piston, has to get strip cleaned. All the shims pulled off it, the piston itself cleaned out and inspected, and if necessary, drilled out. So what does that mean? We need another example with Visual Basic. So let's get rid of this, put this back in here, move our props out of the way, and bring you these two wonderful samples that we collect before we move on to the next thing. So we'll let Dave close in on that one. As you model, shock oil, 1 race season, 14 race weekends. A race weekend consists of normally somewhere in the region of 250 miles, depending on the number of races you're in and the number of practices you do. That's it. Times that by 14, and it isn't a lot of miles, is it really? And we, in general, say change your fork oil every 3,000 to 5,000 miles. Now, if Dave closes in a little bit, and we can see all the steel sludge on the bottom of that. And if we just work it a little bit and tilt it back, and I hold it up, you can see how much is in there. Not very much in the way of mileage, but that's from a full race season. You'd expect there to be some dirt in there, but the entire bottom of the bottle with depth filled full of metal, most people will be very surprised by that. So now let's go to the other extreme. On this one, this bottle is 1 race weekend. Quite literally 1. I shuck it up a little bit. You can see all the metal traces in it circulating around. And if I gently tip it up as well, this is just 1 day. You can see that the bottom is black. So that's 1 day. That's just a couple hundred miles. And then you wonder why pros change fork oil every day, maybe every race weekend, to make sure that none of this blocks up the pistons. It starts to make a lot of sense. So changing fork oil is incredibly important so that all of this debris, and look at that, that's just disgusting, doesn't clog up your piston ports and ruin your front fork's performance. And just to lob one more bomb out there, how much do we depend on our front end? Please include braking in that equation. I would like to see how many people in the chat room put out some statistics in their general riding. Between the front and rear brakes, how much is it? 80% front, 20% rear in terms of brakes and performance and steering? It's a lot. We really depend on the front end, so changing your oil is important. Okay, now I have to clean it up. I've got to push some stuff aside because now I'm going to take a fork off my race bike from this weekend where we raced at Buttonwillow with AFM.
I love how Dave gets disgusted by dirty fork oil.
Dirty fork oil is vile, young man. It is. It's shocking. All right. So, now I'm going to get really messy, so let's get the rubber gloves on. No proctology joke, god damn it. Knock it off. There's enough banter goes on in the chat room before the show. We don't need more. Okay. Now, when these forks were built, since then we tracked the mileage and it's 480 miles. That's it. This is the fork off our VFR 400 race bike, which many of you have seen on sportbikewrench.com in our how-tos, especially in regards to the pit bull stands. So 480 miles, basically enough for 2 race weekends. The oil that was originally in this was blue. So I have to do this carefully so it doesn't go all over the set. And I'm going to basically pour all the oil out that is in the outer chamber. And that is not very blue.
Was blue maximum?
This is, yeah, this, Chris, was Maxima oil that we started with. So that empties the outer chamber, pretty much. Okay, let's close that up. Wipe that down, we don't want it all over the table. That, as you can see in the ratio right jar, is far from blue. Far from it.
Clear blue.
We will show you shortly, Mr. Williams, as to precisely what color blue it was. So looking at that, you can imagine that the oil that's in here, if it was to settle out, will be just the same as our delightful oil right there.
Oh, there you go.
There we go. This has settled out over a course of about 3 weeks. This obviously is very unsettled because it came off the race bike, threw it in the truck, and it came over here. So I'm going to dump this out because this is the clean part of the oil. I shall return to the set shortly.
Now we're recycling that. That was in the sink.
Do you really think the guys in the chat room think I'm chucking oil down the sink into the bay, Chris? Come on. We actually have Chris's latte oil from his RC51 in the oil container at the moment that will be recycled. Now, the outer chamber's empty, so I'm just going to pump this a couple times to empty the cartridge.
EPA's on the way, Dave.
Oh, shit. Ah.
Now we'll take out the dregs that are sitting at the bottom. Dear God, what a mess. No, it's not, Chris, because I'm not giving those trade secrets away. If you are interested, as Chris points out, we will be producing for you a series of downloads on how to do all of this with both telescopic forks and upside down forks. Yuck. That is disgusting. Okay. Now, if we go further with this and do this one more time, the oil that will come out is actually silver, because all that's left in the bottom now is the sludge and all the metal paste that's in there. So, one last tip. There it goes. And that's pretty much all of it out now. Even going down the side of the ratio right, you can see gray trails. All of that is steel or aluminum. Quite the mess. Let's close this up so we don't lose oil all over the set. We'll go ahead and dump that out because I'm actually going to pull these forks apart because they're the race bike and clean them up. Because I was 6th in the race, damn it, and I wanted 3rd. I want better performance out of the forks. So even if we swirl this, but keep the camera there, Chris, pull it back a little bit, Dave. You can see that there's still a gray film from about here down of all the metal that's in there. All right, so let's get rid of this into our oil receiving receptacle. Give this a good wipe out. Get rid of that. And now we'll use the oil we're going to put in there. Now, because we're heading into summer here in California, and it's going to get really hot, at some of the racetracks like Thunderhill, it'll get to at least 110. That's the color oil that went in 480 miles ago. And if we tilt it forward a little bit for Dave, we can see that it is a beautiful, nice blue, almost sky blue. Not the dirty, disgusting gray-black that we had before. I am also going from, as I said, 5 weight to 7.5 because it's going to get so damn hot. I need the extra viscosity to help with the valving. So this will be my oil from now all the way through till maybe September. Depends how hot it is in September. I might just tip the oil that's in there and maintain 7.5 for one race, or I may drop it to 5. Again, it's really important to know what you have so that you can use the appropriate oil for that. So that's what we're going to put in the bike. I'm going to strip clean that. But you could, again, Chris, if you can throw up that picture of the pistons.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. The piston on viewer's left, you can see from that particular picture how large the holes are. So if you have a stock piston, what's really good is that those can be drilled out in some cases. A lot of the modern, i.e. 08 and up stuff, actually has much bigger ports in it, so that it's really quite difficult to block those. But if you imagine a fish has a gel coat on it to protect it, once that paste gets going, that's exactly what it looks like. If you strip a set of forks apart that have, say, 10,000 miles on them, you will see a gel coat of steel particulate over everything. Shims, valves, the whole 9 yards. So it's incredibly important that that stuff gets stripped and cleaned. So let's go through our summary again. 7 and 10 weight oil. Most OEM bikes come with oil like this stock. You can upgrade it, you can go heavier. We've said there's all kinds of ways of doing that. Revalve will, in general, take 5 weight oil, depending on whose valving you've got, who built it, what the specs are. All of these oils, while they say 5 weight, have different viscosities. So go check the viscosity oil index table, Google that up, and keep that as a file on your desktop. That's cartridge forks. And then, of course, if we're going heavier, we have 10, 20, and 30 weight oil and beyond if you have a damping rod fork, which then requires maybe even 10 weight, but through a range and well beyond 30 weight, depending on the style of bike you have, your body weight, and the strength of springs that you use. The one thing we didn't cover are progressive springs. And a lot of today's bikes, even high performance bikes like the R1, have progressive springs in them. So trying to use oil viscosity to damp something like that, like a cruiser fork, you can overdamp it and have the oil too thick unless you put the bike all the way through its stroke, get it to the bottom of the stroke where there's enough energy to force the shock, the fork in this instance, apart. But you can go too far in oil. What does it feel like? Well, it feels really wooden. It feels like really old fork oil on a cold day. 30 miles, the front end seems like it's amplifying bumps. It won't work. It won't absorb bumps at all, and it deflects. It feels kind of vague, or skittish is another word that people use. So if you overdamp or you put too much oil in, it's going to feel like that. And that is something that is of a huge, huge safety concern. If you don't know how much volume, consult your owner's manual. That will tell you specifically. It will give you 2 volumes. Just empty in the oil, or if you've gone through a full strip clean and put in oil in to bleed the whole cartridge out. Again, we'll produce those for you on Sport Bike Wrench to show you how to do this. But there's our segment this evening on fork oil. What to use for cartridge forks, what to use for damping forks, and why you should change the oil regularly so that your compression piston especially doesn't get blocked. So at this point, it's off with the gloves and on to the Q&A, our favorite part, where I'm sure with Sean, we have a ton of questions lined up. So as we do that and move over to the computer, we'll
Set change.
quick set change brought to you, of course, yet again by sportbikewrench.com.
Right now I got the unsprung screen up. So, that'll work.
So hopefully you guys thoroughly enjoyed that.
Okay, Moss.
Yes, sir.
This camera here.
I'm talking to this one, okay.
Hey, beautiful.
And in that case, here we are on the Q&A table once again. The one thing we're going to point out too, we don't have much in the way of...
Oh, hey, Moss.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead and say if you're in the Bay Area. We got
Oh,
a
yeah.
shop. We got a shop here.
Oh yeah. Well, a slew of questions pumps up from Sean. If you guys are interested in getting that work done, then obviously Catalyst Reaction has a shop in Los Angeles in the Orange County area, and we have one here in the Bay Area. It's quite easy for you to go ahead and put your forks in a box and ship them off to Teague or Jim, and they'll take care of you and return them that way. Also shocks as well, if you have those, it's really easy for you to put that in a box as well.
And you can find online stuff at Sport Bike Wrench.
Now, if you're going to do that, you can also find all of those information, all of that information at sportbikewrench.com under suspension. So please go ahead, go there, do some research, and if you have questions, feel free to email me, ottmoss@gmail.com. All right, on to the questions. Rails-1, you had a Yellow Spring Gixxer 1000 shock you were playing with last week. I put the same shock on my second generation SV650 last year. The damping adjustment makes no noticeable change in suspension action whatsoever for compression and rebound. Is it broken or just valve wrong? In parentheses, the shock does feel more planted than a stock SV shock. Yes, it will. Can't tell a difference at standstill, bouncing like Dave does to check rebound, nor at speed. Okay, so my first question to you would be this, Mr. Rails. How many miles were on that shock when you bought it? Do you know? Do you have any idea? If not, I would guess that there are plenty of miles on that shock, and if so, the viscosity of the oil has gotten thinner, and therefore the oil is not up to spec. So a simple service on the shock itself will give you a good, really good idea as to how old the oil is and why your damping isn't, shall we say, there. So you can go from one end to the other. Now, in that particular shock on rebound, there should be, and there is, a very good range of difference in rebound action from all the way in to all the way out, especially in the last third of adjustment coming towards zero damping. There is another thing in there too, that because that particular shock, as do most others, have real sensitivity over pressure, does the shock also have enough of a nitrogen charge? If it doesn't, then you might get something of a similar feeling in the shock, in that your adjustment changes don't seem to make much difference at all. So whenever you're putting surrogate suspension onto something else, please just go get it serviced. You know you've got fresh oil, you know the nitrogen's up to spec. You can take it to a suspension professional anywhere in the country that can service it, recharge it. And the beauty of shocks is when you pull them apart, the valving can be immediately inspected. So if there's a problem in that something isn't working properly internally, it's visually obvious right away. Unlike forks, where you have to pull every single component apart to get to the pistons to see if everything's okay with check valves and things like that. So I would do yourself a favor. I have no idea where you live, but if your race season is coming around, service the forks, service the shock, start fresh, then you know everything you have is on a timetable, and at X number of track days, say 10 or 12, you will go ahead and service the forks, and at 24 you'll service the shock and the forks. In general terms, that means for most guys, you never do 24 track days in a year. That would be luxury, that would be decadent. But if you do, then you would service the forks twice and the shock once. If you're a street guy, service the forks at least every 6 months and the shock once a year if you're doing 5,000 to 7,000 miles. Because then at least, because you're using the bike so much, the way the bike handles will be consistent once you set it up. Thanks for your question. JL Unlimited. Does the fork oil and spring rate have to match in any way? What is the equation? The answer to that is no, there is no equation. In a damping rod fork, for example, if you put a really strong spring in, yes, you're going to need heavier oil. But if you don't push that fork through 3/4 of its travel, the stored energy that's released in a progressive spring is not going to be that great. So you might not, based on your riding style and braking technique, need to have, say, with a 9/0 spring, 15 weight or 20 weight oil. You may find that 10 weight oil works great for you. And it really isn't unusual to have that happen. I know that we have a couple of lighter riders in the 110 to 130 pound range that are very aggressive brakers, but they brake, let go, and then turn the motorcycle. So they don't trail brake the bike, and then you would need heavier oil because you're trying to keep the suspension under load and the rebound action as calm as it can be. Then you will go to maybe a 20 weight oil and see how that works for you. Or you might do a hybrid of mixing 15 and 20, and there's mathematical formulas for the mixing where you can do that, but no, there's no equation. It really, really, honestly does depend on how you ride the motorcycle, especially in regards to braking. Thank you for your question. Boyniku, there are so many different brands of oil out there. How do we decide what to use? Is it just personal preference, or are some brands better than others, etc.? In regards to your question there, Niku, there are oils out there that may be a little bit more durable than others. So for example, on the race bikes we use with guys that are trying to win class championships, we'll use AMSOIL for, say, non-Öhlins engineered forks. We may use Öhlins engineered forks based on that application because they've designed and used it that way. If we have other internals which we will build at the shop using different components, say a GP suspension kit, we may use 5 or 7.5 weight, and a lot of that again depends on the ambient temperature. For track and race bikes, because you change the oil a lot, that doesn't matter too much. And so we come back to the point that I was giving everybody at the start of the show. Go find, via Google, an oil viscosity table. Look up the brand of oil, find the viscosity ratings and heat ranges for those oil, and then if you, for example, have a Motul and then there's a Maxima Amsoil, a Bel-Ray, a Silcoline that are all right around that oil on the oil viscosity table, then you can buy any of those, because the performance when you're riding the motorcycle will be extremely close to what you had before. So no oil is better than another. All the oils are engineered, obviously, but you need to find the one that's closest to the oil that you have been using. Hopefully that answers your question. Fairly straightforward, but a good question nonetheless. Next question. Long Dog Racing. My race setup, per the direction of my suspension guy, calls for 30 weight in my SV650. Does that sound too heavy, even though I feel it works great? I have springs and weight and emulators. No, it doesn't. Like I said, I would run 30 weight in Portland, Oregon on my production 650 with the stock forks once the temperature got up there, because it provided much more consistent damping while I was trying to win the race, in essence. If the oil viscosity or the damping effect of the oil went away, then I couldn't push the bike into the corner with as much confidence, because now I'm asking the tire to provide suspension support, because the oil can't control the rebound damping, and I will get pump in the front forks and be unable to go around a corner as fast as I could. 30 weight may be too heavy based on ambient temperature. So I don't know if you have tried a lesser weight. Have you tried 20 weight? Have you given it a go when it's colder weather? Does it give you the same thing that you are experiencing with the 30 weight? So I would encourage you to go ahead and try that and see back to back what it feels like. I don't know how long the 30 weight oil has been in there. Is it time for a change? Well, then try 20 weight. The other important facet about this is thicker oil, you need less. Not much, but you need less. You don't need it to the same level. So 20 weight, the oil level should be a little higher. 30 weight, a little less. And we found that to be true every single time we've used it. So that's a good question. Hopefully that was a straightforward answer for you. Again, on the service side, if your oil's old and you put fresh oil in, you'll find consistency in damping. So if the 30 weight feels great to you, run it. It ain't broke. Don't fix it. If you're having a great time with the bike, continue onward, but at some point, do some experimentation. You might be surprised in what you find. All right, on to the next one. Trick Orange 10R, if you are running what you believe is the correct weight oil, what indicators dictate a possible change to a different weight? There's a couple things there in that. So let's pick an example. I'll use the VFR because I've got that experience. It's fresh in my mind from this weekend from racing. We valved it, we put 5 weight in it, we set the oil level, we went out and raced. I didn't need a ton of preload. I set the damping where I wanted it and was quite happy with that. However, in G-out, long G-out turns, in this particular track, there's a complex from Riverside over Lost Hills, as it's called on that particular track, where I had variable geometry, where once the oil got hot, all of a sudden the rebound damping was inadequate. So as I came off the banking into the right-hand turn, as the race went on, the front end wouldn't allow me to tighten the line. Instead, I had to lean on the front to continue to have it pull down. Now, obviously, that oil has 480 miles on it. But during the race, when it got really hot, and the temperatures, I think it's fair to say, were somewhere in the low 80s, I noticed by lap 4, then lap 5, and definitely in lap 6, because it was banked, the bike was trying to climb up the banking because the front end was getting taller while I'm trying to bring the bike down and use the G out of the track to pull the bike to the apex. So it's pretty clear to me at that point, given the heat, that the 5-weight with that rebound setting was inadequate. If I'd have gone a little further, I wouldn't have had quite the same handling in the first 3 laps, but better handling in the final laps. And when you're in a 6-lap sprint, you have to get as far forward as you can, as quickly as is humanly possible. Therefore, the bike has to handle as best as possible the first 3 laps. After that, people string out and you push as hard as you can on the last couple. So that was my particular quandary from my experience. So in answer to your question, Tenar, that indicated to me that as the duration of the race went on, the oil wasn't thick enough. And I think a 7.5 and opening the rebound up a little bit would have given me more consistent damping throughout the race, where I could have come off that banking and held the line no problem without having to lean on the handlebar and physically pull the bike down to the apex. That's one test. And I think that's a really appropriate example to use for you and for example, for everybody else that's here with the show tonight and is watching it as video on demand later. That's a really, really good example to use, how you think it's valved right, you think you've got the right weight, but when you actually physically ride it and get it stinking hot, it isn't quite right. All right, Gunner 971. Does fork oil, much like brake fluid, go bad after being opened and sitting on the shelf for a short time? If so, how long before it goes bad? I've had fork oil on the shelf for almost 6 months, freshened the forks up, thrown the oil in, and really not noticed much degradation there at all. I don't often hear with fellow suspension professionals an instance of a bad gas story where it's been left in the carbs and varnished the carbs after a year or whatever. You don't often hear that story, and in going through my memoirs here, I really can't remember or recall anybody saying how, oh no, if I crack open an oil, it's got to be gone in a month. You know, like a keg of Guinness, for example, it's only good for a few weeks. I don't believe so. Like I said, from my own experience, I've used oil on my race bike that's been sat on the shelf for 6 months and gone back to it when it's gone back to the cold season and finished that off and used it in the forks again and not seen a problem. I think what would kill oil is heat. If it's in a room where the temperature is the same all the time, that's fine. But if you heat it up and cool it off and heat it up and cool it off, I would imagine that will be far worse for the oil in terms of degrading over time than just sitting on a shelf in a controlled environment. There's probably some mad scientist over there that will have some theory of degradation based on time, UV rays, heat cycles, and everything else, but I'm not that guy. But I'm sure there's somebody who is. So from my own experience, no, as long as it's in a stable temperature environment, it should be fine for up to a year. Boyniku again, along the same lines as the question above, is it bad to shake the oil? Not at all. Because you have additives in oil, let's roll that back a little bit. When oil is used in forks, or an engine for that matter, it's pounded, it's thrown all over the place. And with the additives and everything else that are suspended in the oil, it keeps it consistent. So no, I would say it's good to shake the oil. When you ride the bike on the street, the forks get pounded, the oil travels around. That keeps it consistent. So I would say no, shake the hell out of it. Treat it like a cocktail jar and give it a damn good shaking. Especially if it's been sat on the shelf for a while and you're going to throw it in some forks or whatever. Absolutely. On to the next one. Dave Tuvan, do you find certain oil brands weep past seals easier than others? Do oils of the same weight just have different formulas? Also, what is the normal span of fork oil seals? So your first part, Dave, no. A fork seal, if it's doing its job right, even if you have 0 weight fork oil, should not get through the fork seal. Period, end of story, done. Check the boxes, Mr. Williams would say.
Oh, yeah.
Boom. Oh no, that's John Madden.
Boom goes dynamite.
Yeah, boom goes the dynamite. Super producer Chris throws in. A fork seal is a fork seal. Like I said earlier on, the guy with the FJR with 50,000 miles on his forks and they hadn't leaked at all. They will go a long time. His went so long because I think about every month he said, he cleaned the chrome tubes with chrome polish, which is slightly abrasive, and made sure there were no rust spots, no insect carcasses on there, nothing, and kept them really well polished, and that also helps reduce stiction. So in regards to the normal lifespan of fork seals, there's a couple things here. A fork seal actually grips the fork via a spring that screws into itself and forms a circle. Over time, that spring may get weak. If, for example, a bike sits, a race bike will sit over winter from, say, October till February in exactly the same position. Now, if that spring isn't exercised, it's not going to keep tension on the fork seal itself to seal out and keep in the oil. So you move the bike all of a sudden, and a lot of guys will always find a leak down the fork or maybe even a puddle under the fork leg. It's not that the fork seal is bad, it's that the spring that screws into itself has gotten weak. And a lot of time guys will come to me at the track and go, ah, I'm losing all my fork oil. I just wipe it up, go ride, come back, wipe it up, go ride, and it'll be fine. And 9 times out of 10, that's exactly what happens, because the spring will get exercised, and all of a sudden, just like muscle memory, it gets to grip again. The other side of seal life is this. When things get hot, fluids will evaporate. Your only lubrication between the fork seal and the tube is grease. So the grease will at some point evaporate. Now for guys that have slightly older bikes with chrome tubes, whether they're upside down or right side up, if you see on your chrome tube black kind of ingrained into the chrome, that is your fork seal melting into the fork to provide lubrication. On a race bike, I will grease my fork seals every 3 races, very lightly with seal grease. I'll use, for example, Racetech seal grease, to make sure that the seal isn't dry and binding on the chrome tube. It's very important to make sure that if you have longevity in seals, especially when you run them at the track and at the race, that those seals stay lubricated. Very simple process. That's another one of these how-tos we're going to create for you this summer. But that makes sure that you don't get something called stiction. And if you get stiction, you melt the fork seal into the metal, and eventually that will wear away enough material that it will leak, and then it will pour. So that's the first side of that. The second side is, as we just covered earlier, cleaning your fork tube. Whether it's a DLC coating, a tinitride coating, anything like that, it's really, really important that you clean that meticulously at least once a month. Scrub it down, get all the dirt and debris off it. If necessary, use 600 grit emery cloth, which comes in a long strip, or get an old t-shirt, pull a rag off and make it a strip and put the chrome polish on that and run it backwards and forwards around the tube. Get behind, take a little time, take the damn fender off so you can get behind there and polish the entire fork all the way up to the dust seal. And that, if you do that regularly, you will never lose a fork seal because there's nothing there to cut the seal. And the number one thing that cuts seals are dead insect carcasses, which turn into razor blades because they get baked, and it'll rip a seal completely apart. Lastly on that, for people that live out by the coast, if you get rust spots, you need to file those rust spots down below the level of your chrome tube itself. And then you need to make sure that rust is permanently kept away by sanding them frequently. Rust will also rip a seal straight through the middle. So it's really important if you live out by the coast, nothing wrong with putting WD-40 on a rag and wiping it to protect it. Obviously in the upper areas where you don't get too often in terms of travel, if you use a zip tie, just keep that nicely soaked very lightly with something like WD. Really help the longevity of your fork and specifically your seal. All right, next one. Another question from JL Unlimited. Where would the manufacturer have all the information for changing the oil, either for racing or regular use on the street? So manufacturers, up until the last few years, didn't really have a schedule for you to change fork oil. Of late, I've been around some dealerships. BMW does. Aprilia says you should change your fork oil every 6,000 miles. Go Aprilia. Absolutely. That's awesome. So in some dealerships, that is now becoming information that is in the service manual. Ducati has it, although it's a little far out at 1,000 miles. But that information is starting to appear. The reason for forks, again, just to reinforce if you're joining the show late and you missed the first part, changing your fork oil regularly is important because the spring scrapes constantly. The oil gets heat cycled tremendously during its short life. And so we don't want to get that metal sludge in the bottom, nor do we want our oil to turn into Mrs. Butterworth syrup in the cold mornings. So if your OEM service manual doesn't have a spec, then like I said, for street bikes, 5,000 miles. Race bikes, forks every 3 races, maybe 4 race weekends, change it. The shock can go race season, so if you have 7 or 8 races, just do it once a year. And again, based on ambient temperature, for example, Jeff Tigert, #1 plate holder in Willow Springs. Once we reached mid-season with him, June, when it started getting up, we upped the oil weight in his shock to prevent fade, because he'd get into 10 and 12 lap races and the back would go away and he'd lose grip. So bear that in mind, really important. And your second part about changing oil front to back at the same time. If you buy a bike that you don't know anything about, service it. Just get it done, get it over with, deal with it. Usually 2 fork changes to 1 shock change on an annual basis. So I think we're done with that. Okay, Trick Orange 10R, was that a typical KYB fork? Yes, indeed. Absolutely. Most forks internally are structurally identical because they'll have the compression piston at the bottom of the cartridge, then your cartridge itself, then your rebound piston inside, which moves on the rod as the fork moves, your spring, preload spacer, and cap. That is different in forks, for example, like the R1, Triumph Tiger 1050, where rebound is in the right leg, compression is in the left leg. If you get an Öhlins 30mm kit, that is rebound in the right, compression in the left. So there's a difference there, obviously, but it still has a cartridge. So it's still the same. All right. Next one. We have, excuse me, we have no questionnaire. Could you or would you use, let's see, use your form oil in light of changing your springs for your forks? What would be wise? Okay. I think what you're asking there is, would you use a different oil in light of changing your springs? Would that be wise? Again, I think that relates to how you use the motorcycle. A, do you have a damping rod? B, do you have a cartridge? If you find, for example, like we mentioned earlier, the 06, 07 R6, 15 weight oil in that for an aggressive trail breaker who rides fast at the track works absolutely brilliantly. But that isn't a spring change. So if you're changing the springs on a cartridge, be careful with that. If you're changing the springs on a damping rod fork, absolutely try a heavier weight oil in regards to that. That's worth experimenting, because when you think about it, we all depend on the front end so much that to get that working for the price of 20, 40, or 60 bucks for oil experimentation, that's money well spent, I think. You may disagree, but I think that's money well spent. So yes, it would be wise. All right. Trick Orange 10R. Does the big hole piston that we showed you the photograph of use a shim stack to aid in the valving since the holes are so big? So in that instance, when you have more oil flow, and we didn't bring you an aftermarket piston where there's very little aluminum in it whatsoever, yes, the shim stack has to match the flow of oil coming through it. That's one of the things that people don't really get, in that putting an aftermarket piston in makes this great performance jump. Well, it does that because of the shim stack on top of the piston, in the way that as the oil hits it, it flexes, and the way in which it flexes. Now, we'll get into shim stacks when we get towards the end of our season for Dave Moss Unsprung, because we'll lay that out and show you how that works. But yes, the more oil you flow, the bigger the shim stack has to be to control that. Long dog racing. So when we talk about a 20 millimeter or a 25 millimeter fork kit, is that talking about piston hole diameters? No, it's talking about piston diameter, not the amount of oil that can flow through it. Quite simple, straightforward, and different. That solely relates to the diameter of the piston. Good question though, because I'm sure some other people were thinking about that. All right, ZX10 ride. When you change your stock compression pistons to aftermarket pistons with bigger holes, how does that affect the adjustments as they relate to stock adjusters and range of adjustment? All right, if you've pulled in aftermarket pistons and you have a shim stack on top of that that is matched to the amount of oil that will come through it, how does that affect your adjustments? Well, ideally, based on your compression piston and your compression or rebound adjuster, what should happen is that you find there is a greater range of adjustability. Because if you have, for example, an aftermarket piston put in there, the needle taper that goes in tandem with the valving should yield much better feel. Instead of it being every 5 to 8 clicks, it might be every 3 to 5 clicks you can feel a difference, because you have much greater control over the flow of the oil from the valving itself. So when you manipulate the damping adjustment via rebound and compression, there's a much finer adjustment which is much more tangible when you're riding the bike. That's why when you upgrade, both high and low speed damping characteristics change substantially, which will also reflect on the tire wear. But to your question, the adjusters will be much more sensitive with the stock ones. Now, a lot of times you will also have available needles and pistons and shim stacks which come as a complete kit because they're engineered to go together. It's okay to keep your standard rebound needle, your standard compression needle in place with an aftermarket piston and shim stack, because you will still feel a profound difference. You'll just notice there isn't such a great range of adjustment throughout. Good question. That was a really good question. All right, we'll take a few more. We'll go to 7:15, and then we'll have to call it. UTP 216. All that sludge comes off forks. Let me reread this for a second. All the sludge comes off springs hitting the inside of the fork. Yes, that's all that's created by it, because that's the only moving component there that comes into physical contact. So the spring will scrape on the inside of the fork itself and create that paste. Just quite simply that, because there's nothing else that comes into contact inside the fork other than the spring. That is what creates that fine metal paste that you have to get rid of. Boyniku, is there any way to slow down the amount of metal coming off the spring and into the oil? Don't ride. Leave the bike at home. Not really. No, there isn't. Because the front forks work. The softer the front fork is, obviously the more range of travel you're going to go through, so maybe if you stiffen the preload on the fork and turn the compression up a little bit, it might make a difference. But as you saw from my VFR race forks, after 480 miles, it's already quite polluted. The oil has a ton of particulate in it. If there was a way, I think you'd be loaded. You'd be full of cash right now because people would come to you with that solution, no question of it. All right, Trick Orange, 10R. What tools are required for a DIY fork change? Is this possible without any special tools? Yes, absolutely, it is. It's messy, but it can be done. You would do as I did tonight. You would open the fork cap, pour the oil out, you would screw the fork cap closed, and you would exercise the fork to empty the inner chamber, and then you'd let them hang overnight into a ratio right. Whatever came out is what you put back in. Quite literally that. The big mistake people make is not to write that down. They look at the jug, they saw the oil level, they throw it away, clean the jug, come back and go, oh, damn it. So if you are going to do it at home, mark on the fork itself with a Sharpie how much came out. That way, when you take it away, clean it, bring it back, you know how much to. If it's been a long time, please strip clean the forks. Get all of that sludge out of there and start fresh with clean oil, and then your volume will stay pretty consistent. Realize there is a huge difference between what we call a dump and run, which is what we did tonight. Just dump the oil out of the forks, get 90% out of it, and then fill it with that volume back in, versus a proper tear down and clean, where the shims are cleaned, you check the piston, make sure there's no debris in there. That's different. And you'll always find that if you have a bone dry fork, just the same as changing oil in a motor. If you pull the oil filter off, there's a different capacity. So use that analogy when doing forks. If you do a dump and run, it's going to be X. If you've got a strip clean, it's Y. Make some notes. As we have said in the past, know your bike, and that way you can do it at home. It really isn't that difficult. Look for Sport Bike Wrench with our downloads. There'll be a 3 or a 5-part series on changing fork oil coming up this summer, specifically to help you guys who want to do it at home. All right, Long Dog Racing. Is telescopic the same as damping rod forks? Okay. Telescopic refers to a fork where the leg is on the bottom, like our venerable. This is a telescopic fork, where the chrome tube itself is clamped and held, and the leg moves up and down that way. That's a telescopic fork. Our Gixxer 750 project bike is an upside down fork, where the chrome tube is at the bottom, at the foot where the axle goes through. So telescopic fork, traditional fork. Upside down fork, reversed, where the chrome tube is at the bottom. So you got a couple things confused. A damping rod fork is where the internal is just a damping rod itself that sits at the bottom of the fork. A cartridge fork is like our ZX6, and let me disappear and come back without falling over. That is our cartridge fork. Let me move that. So the cartridge is at the bottom. There's a rod through the spring that is connected to the cap. That is a cartridge. So you got two things confused there. Damping rod and cartridge are inside the fork. Telescopic fork and upside down fork are structural differences, and terminology is used in that way. Hopefully that cleared that up for you. All right, UTP 216. What is a safe solvent for cleaning fork parts during service? I have a safety clean parts washer at work. Is that okay to use? Absolutely. Please, if you're going to do that, leave it in there overnight. Let it really start work on the sludge at the bottom. Also, what is incredibly useful is a bottle brush. And you can get that pretty much anywhere. And with that, if you've got it especially immersed in something like a safety clean or the hot cleaners that we use here in California, get a bottle brush down there in the bottom and go to work. The thing about all of that though is you want to make sure when you reassemble it, it's all bone dry and clean when you put it all back together. That's fine for the fork outer and the chrome tube or the DLC tube and the foot itself. It's not okay for valving. So I would not immerse a fork with all its internal contents in there, just the big components. The outer tube and the leg itself can go in. The cartridge, no, you should get that out of there and clean that separately. But otherwise, you go ahead and use it. You've got it at work, it's free, dump it in there. All right, couple more questions. All right. Oh, that jumped considerably. Wow, we got another 30 questions. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get to those.
Yeah, you have 4 minutes.
Mr. Williams, I have what I have. I'm being told here. All right, moose knuckles. What would be the best method to blend fork oil? We, in general, use 30% of the heavier weight, 70% of the lighter weight to blend to get a different weight. I think it's important that you do a little research on that because certain manufacturers suggest blending ratios based on the way they engineer their oil. And that information is readily available. So I would encourage you to go to the manufacturer and say what are your blending procedures, and they'll know them straight out the gate. That's a great question. Thank you for that. All right, another question, but no question E. What will be the right oil level for a bike? One level or a different level? Would 10 weight of one brand be the same as a weight of another? Oil level, go to the manufacturer's handbook for your bike and put it in there if it's stock. Just do as the manual suggests and you can't go wrong. If you are using stock valving and you're going to the track or you're going to race, you may need a little more oil or a smaller air gap in the fork itself to help because of the extreme duress that the bike's being put under with braking. If you brake, let go, and turn, you probably could get away with stock. If you trail brake really aggressively, then you're definitely going to need more oil to have a little more damping effect from the air cushion itself. So I would say you need to play with oil level, but only if you're racing. Only if you're racing. Track and street, no. Okay. Next one from MacDW69. How does cold oil take to warm in the morning if it's cool out? One lap like tires? No. I wish it was that simple. It'd be really great if it was. If it's cold out, your oil is contained in metal. The metal is cold. You are now going to go do, say, 60, 70 mile an hour in cold air. What's the wind chill effect on that metal? I know you can't do the math off the top of your head, but you get the point. So if it's 40 degrees out, you ignore speed limits and do high speeds, the wind chill on the metal is quite severe. Because you're doing high speeds, the fork oil isn't circulating very quickly in general because the bike's going so quickly and you're not hitting a ton of bumps slowly, which would really exercise the fork. So the fork oil will stay cold for quite a while. I tell people in general, if it's cool out and the oil's reasonably old, to go 50 miles nice and steady, just nice and slow, focus on braking and letting go of the brakes so that you work the front end and that you're turning the bike fairly frequently if the road allows that to exercise the fork and get it through a range of travel. The range of travel will put more heat into the suspension than driving quickly. So that's a pretty good question. All right, so let's do 2 more. Okay. Mr. Kazo, is it fair game to run one weight in one leg and another weight in the other to have an aggregate weight between the two? You can do that with fork springs, but I wouldn't do that with fork oil. I've heard that before too. Somebody asked me about that, in that if they had a right bias track, they put 10 weight in one leg and 7 weight in the other. I personally, no. I wouldn't do that. I'd want the damping response, because there are right and left turns, to be the same. I wouldn't want it biased in one direction over another. So I'd say no. We will put my head on the French guillotine block and see how it rolls in the chat room. All right, Dave Supreme. My name is Dave Moss too. What? I have a ZRX in Central Florida. What weight oil would you recommend? That's hilarious. Let's finish on that one. All right, if you live out in Florida, let's see, we were there for Daytona. What was it, Chris, in the 30s?
Cold.
It was extraordinarily nipply, as we would say back home. It was bloody freezing. I would say if you're running a ZRX, of which I have one, I would be running in the winter down there, probably 10 weight, and then up it to 15 for the summer. Again, depends what you're doing with it. There's not many twisty roads down there. So I would say that you could probably get away with 10 weight year round, unless you're going to the track. If you're going to Daytona or you're going to Jennings, then I'd probably up it to 15 in the front. If it's a stock ZRX, please, depending on your body weight, consider the springs you have in the front. They are quite soft. And the damping is also very soft too. So if you're going to keep it for a while, 3 to 5 years, invest on the front end, definitely for springs and valving, because it will make a huge difference. Hopefully you're part of the ZRX OA forum. They have an incredible forum full of tons and tons of useful information. So please go there and sign up with them. All right, guys, it was great this week. I really want to thank you. I want to thank sportbikewrench.com, performance parts and professional advice. Please go there, check out the deals we have and the how-to videos to help you do an installation. And as always, we thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Dave Moss Unsprung. See you guys.